Good evening. Welcome. Very good to see such a full hall for this excellent discussion we're going to have tonight. I'm Bronwyn Maddox, editor of Prospect magazine, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to this event. Really delighted to be chairing tonight, all the more as I read the book this week, and to be able to introduce you to our distinguished guest speakers. John Micklethwaite, here, is the editor-in-chief of The Economist, and after studying history at Magdalen College, Oxford, worked as a banker at Chase Manhattan before joining The Economist as a finance correspondent in 1987. He was named an editor's editor by the British Society of Magazine Editors, a very austere body, I can tell you, in 2010. Adrian Wooldridge is The Economist's management editor and writes the Schumpeter column. He was previously based in Washington, D.C. as the bureau chief there, where he also wrote the very well-followed Lexington column. And together, they're the author of 5 previous acclaimed agenda-setting books, which emerge, I can tell you, if you're in the world of current affairs, emerge and without people knowing they're coming and make an enormous impact on their arrival. The Witch Doctors, A Future Perfect, The Company, The Right Nation, and God is Back. Tonight, they join us to share some of the thinking from their new work, The Fourth Revolution. In this book and in their talk, they talk about 3 great revolutions that they argue have taken place in the history of the nation-state. And in each of these, they would say, Europe and America have set the example, have been the model. But we're now, they're going to put to you, in the middle of a 4th one, and it's not clear that Western values, democracy, free markets, liberalism, are going to win against the other models that countries have of running themselves. It's one of the central debates at the moment of whether democracy is going to hold its own against its rivals and which political values are really going to triumph, if you like, in the 21st century. So without further ado, let's kick off, and please join me in welcoming John Micklethwaite, Adrian Wooldridge.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bronwyn. The cult of editors, we have to stay together. We will talk about the book, and then we'll have questions, and then we'll open it up. I think the clue to the book, or the main place to start, is in the subtitle, which is The Global Race to Reinvent the State. And our starting point is one which is almost sort of based around the idea of progress. We think the worst form of competition to be in is one where you don't really know you're in that competition. And that was what happened to, say, Encyclopaedia Britannica, when you were sitting there worrying terribly about whether other reference books were going to be better than you, and suddenly you're taken apart by something like Wikipedia, which comes from where you never expected it, or the British motorbike industry back in the 70s, not thinking at all about the Japanese. Why do we think that? Because when we look at government at the moment, or Western government, we think it's in roughly the same state, in a competition it doesn't quite know it's in. And if I look at the European elections last week, I look at the midterms coming up in America in November, I see the same thing, which I would describe as a version of discordant apathy. Prospect's written about this, we've written about this. And it is where voters are very, very angry, very, very cross with the politics that they have, not just in terms of the approval ratings of politicians. 3 most popular politicians at the moment are outside Parliament. It's also to do with the parties. The Conservative Party used to have 3 million members. Now it's got 128,000. If that was a business, it would be out of business. If you look at, it's not just that, it's also the sense that despite being very angry, very cross, nothing is going to change. Nothing is really going to alter, no matter what the voters do, no matter what politicians do. That is the kind of prevailing thoughts, actually on both sides of the Atlantic at the moment. And the reason why we wrote this book is to say that is wrong. It's wrong for a good reason and a bad reason. It's wrong, the sort of good reason is that really, if you look at history, as Bronwyn just said, Western government has kept on reinventing itself. It does change. It changes in really dramatic ways. The fact it hasn't really changed much for, we would argue, almost 100 years doesn't mean it's not going to revert to type and start changing again. And the second reason is technology. The second good reason is technology. If you really think that the wave of changes that have gone all the way through the private sector, affected everything, most of all the media business, if you really think those changes are not going to hit the public sector, well then I think you can justifiably say, well look, none of this stuff is going to happen. But we think would be extremely surprising if that did not happen. So that's the good reason why government will change. The bad reason is that actually, yes, this time the West is in a competition to do with values, competition to do with democracy, because now, finally, Asia is back. Asia now has an alternative method of government, and Asia, remember, we will argue, at one time was miles ahead of us. From their perspective, this is coming back, and so that introduces the three revolutions of Western government, which is the reason why we think the West climbed ahead. And here's Adrian.
If you go back to the year 1600, I think only a madman would ever have predicted that Western Europe, that Europe would become the dominant power in the world. You might have thought it would be the Ottoman Empire or perhaps India, and you might well have thought it would have been China. In 1600, there were 3 cities in Europe that had populations of more than 300,000 people. That was the population of the Forbidden City alone in Beijing. And many of those 300,000 people in Beijing were Mandarin civil servants selected from the whole of this huge country by objective, merit-based examinations. It was an extraordinary system of government. And yet, over the next 300 or 400 years, the West pulls relentlessly ahead. And it pulls relentlessly ahead essentially because it has 3 great revolutions in government. The first revolution was a public order revolution. It was the revolution that was created by the rise of the nation state. We regard the great symbol, the great philosopher of this revolution, essentially as Thomas Hobbes, the author of Leviathan, because he said that the fundamental thing that the state must do is provide public order. And that is exactly what the nation state does over the next few hundred years. It gets rid of all these warring barons who've been tearing countries apart. It gets rid of wars of religion by saying essentially that the king should decide the religion of his people, creates public order. But it creates public order in a way that doesn't get rid of competition. You have order within states, but competition between states for preeminence, diplomatic preeminence, military preeminence, trading preeminence. So in China, when they invent gunpowder, they use it to create fireworks. We use it to create wars. They may be more civilized than us, but we tended to dominate for the next few hundred years because of that. In China, when they traded with other countries, the emperor got very upset about this, and he basically said to all the people who lived on the rich southern coast in the mid-16th century, you have to move 17 miles inland. We don't want you contaminated by these other people around the world. Europe, by contrast, trades with the rest of the world, creates empires with the rest of the world. All these countries are constantly competing with each other. So Brazil is taken over by Portugal, Spain has its Latin American empire, and of course Britain has a huge empire all around the world. Order within, competition between countries, external power. That's the first revolution, the public order revolution. The second revolution is the liberal revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This is a revolution that we tend to associate with France or with America, but the country that we find really intriguing in this period is Britain, partly because we're British, partly because Britain was the great global power of the time, it was the America of its time, but partly because what Britain does in this period has extraordinary resonance with the situation of the state today. Between 1815 and 1848, Britain essentially reduces taxation from about £80 million a year to £60 million a year, but it does that at the same time that it makes government smaller, more efficient, more accountable. It's providing schools, it's providing hospitals, it's providing roads, it's providing a sewerage system at a time when the population is actually growing by 50%. How does it pull off this extraordinary miracle? It does it partly by, Gladstone said he went round government saving candle ends and cheese pairings for the good of the country. It's partly just by saving. But more importantly, it's by changing the nature of government. Government in the 18th century was essentially a system of sinecures, pensions, rent-seeking, for the ruling class, Micklethwaite's ancestors. And what it did was to rip out these sinecures and this rent-seeking and say you must compete on the basis of open competition to get jobs in the civil service, that government functions must be utilitarian, they must provide services for the people. So you can focus government, contract the state, but also provide services for the people. That's a great revolution. It makes the state more efficient, more accountable, and more defensive of fundamental individual freedoms. In the late 19th century, however, you get two complaints about this what we call lean government liberalism. One is that it's not compassionate enough. You get Dickens talking about grad grind in hard times. You get John Stuart Mill, the great prophet of libertarianism, saying that actually what does open competition for the civil service mean if some people aren't getting enough education to become part of this competition? At the same time, you get a sort of national greatness critique of this view of government. The British are looking over at Germany and saying, wait a minute, Germany's got an activist state, a state that's building tariffs, a state that's building schools, a state that's building universities, and they're leaping ahead of Britain when it comes to the new technology of engineering and chemicals, the new industries of the time. So there's a push towards a more activist state. And this lays the foundations for what we call our third revolution, which is the rise of the welfare activist state in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And just as the first revolution is associated with Hobbes, the second with Mill and the utilitarian liberals, the third is really driven by Sidney and particularly Beatrice Webb. They have this notion that the state can be compassionate and efficient, that it's better at running a country than the market. They create the Fabian Society, the London School of Economics, the New Statesman, to spread this doctrine of the state. They look at the huge industrial empires being created by Henry Ford in the United States through economies of scale and scope and division of labour, and say we can apply exactly those same methods to the state. So the state begins to grow. You get the Great Depression, and of course, as a result of that, the building of a bigger state. You get in Europe, particularly in Britain, the New Jerusalem created by the Labour government after the Second World War. You get in America the Great Society. Again and again and again, the argument that the state can make a better, more pleasant, more efficient society. And this argument really works in a fairly dramatic way. You get sustained economic growth. You get France celebrating its growth. You get Germany and this sort of miracle economy after the Second World War. You get Harold Macmillan saying you've never had it so good. People whose parents never went to school or only went to school, to elementary school, get free places in universities. You get this huge expansion of the public sector which provides good, stable jobs for a growing population. Everything looks wonderful. And then, in the 1970s, things begin to go wrong. You get stagflation, so you're spending money but you're not getting much much out of it. You get the war on poverty, and it seems that poverty wins. You get violence growing in the inner cities in the United States. In Britain, you have the great question of who rules Britain, because you've got interest groups, particularly trade unions, which keep subverting government and keep grabbing more power for themselves. Inflation, crime, stagnation, and you get a general sense of sort of moral degradation, moral decline. And I think the worst point in this great moral decline of the 70s took place in a sauna in San Francisco, and it involved two boys who'd just finished their high school education and two elderly men. John was one of those boys, and he's going to tell you what he did with the two men.
It was true. I was on my gap year, as they say, and I was travelling around America, and I went to go and stay. The person I was travelling with is now a general in the British Army, and we went to go and stay with a cousin of his who was living in an apartment block in San Francisco. He was a rich British guy, made a lot of money and escaped taxes and gone to San Francisco. And he persuaded us to go and have a sauna with his friend Milton, who lived not uncoincidentally right next door to him. And we sat there in the sauna, and Milton asked us questions like, who was Margaret Thatcher? She'd just been elected. Did we know her? He knew her. He started depicting this slightly strange world where British Rail was going to be privatised, where British Leyland, the big old car company, was going to be broken up, sold off, where monetarism, this weird thing that I didn't really understand, was going to happen, where we were all going to end up with education vouchers. And I sort of sat there amongst the steam and thought, this is completely mad. It was sort of deeply hallucinogenic. On the same trip, I went to go and watch The Grateful Dead. And this was like the equivalent of that, only somewhat madder and completely unlikely. I'd just come from a boarding school in Yorkshire where we'd had to be taught by candlelight sometimes because of the miners. Well, the man in the case, though, was Milton Friedman. And the world which he depicted, and which him and Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan did, that was a kind of half-revolution back against the world that Adrian depicted. Because Reagan and Thatcher did change some things. They changed the idea that the state should run business. Thatcher did a huge amount of that. And just like all the other revolutions Adrian's just talked about, these were things from Britain which went all the way around the world. Go to Eastern Europe, go to Latin America. You'll see still the effects of what she did. They also changed the debate. It's very hard now to just stand there and say your answer to something is more government. There might be a case where you can say government helps in this way, but the general philosophy, the sort of things that Lyndon Johnson said, the sort of things that the New Jerusalem was about, Ed Miliband won't say that. Even François Hollande won't go that far. Certainly Barack Obama won't. So they won a kind of debate, but they lost a big chunk of the reality. Margaret Thatcher spent 10 years desperately trying to tame the state. And she did do an amazing thing. She reduced welfare spending from 22.9% of GDP all the way down to 22.2%. The numbers of the state, and it's still true, the one consistent of all our lives is the state has kept on growing and growing and growing. And that has been the reality of the Western state pretty much all the time since the Webbs. And it's not just a matter of proportion to GDP, it's regulations. Adrian mentioned the Webbs. Sidney Webb was the son of a hairdresser. He would have been shocked if he went to Florida today and discovered that you need to spend 2 years in order to get a license to be a hairdresser, another 2 years to become an interior designer. Whatever Leviathan was meant to do, it wasn't there to stop us having clashing colour schemes in our sitting rooms. You go to the flat near where George Orwell wrote 1984, or where he wrote 1984. Around that, I think there's 32 different security cameras. The state is much more intrusive than any of us, and it's kept on getting more intrusive. And the reason is us, because it's not just the left. The left asks for hospitals and schools. The right asks for prisons, more military spending. And the wave of regulation that we deal with is just as likely to come from the right. It's just as likely to be the Daily Mail saying something must be done as it is from The Guardian. And the reason really is us. We are like Augustus Gloop, the boy in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, who just wanted more and more and more. But in the end, like with Augustus, it had to stop, and that's not a bad place to introduce Adrian.
Why do we believe that we're actually at the beginning of a fourth revolution? Many people have argued that we're going to see revolutions in the nature of government and the state in recent years. Bill Clinton had Al Gore running his Reinventing Government Commission. Not that much came of that. But we actually do believe that things are going to change, and indeed things have already started to change. First of all, because the age of more, the age of ever more, has now come to a shuddering end. We've had since 2007 governments borrowing $16 trillion in order to get us out of the hole that was dug in the recession. But I don't think this sort of deficit financing is going to go on for much longer for many reasons. One is that we've got into the habit of running a deficit perpetually. Keynes said that you should run deficits to prevent recessions from turning into depressions. You should do it as a sort of medicine that you only take at a time of illness. We've got into the habit of doing this all the time, and the effect of all this spending has in many ways diminished. It's become a medicine that doesn't work anymore. More importantly, we see the population ageing. We see the baby boom generation beginning to retire. In Europe, this ageing is going to change the structure of the population, so there's going to be a significantly larger old group of people being supported by a significantly smaller younger group of people. The same will happen in America, not to the same degree, but it will certainly happen. So that's really putting an end in the long term to this perpetual deficit financing. Secondly, I think there are really positive reasons for thinking that the state can improve. Partly that better management can improve dramatically the state. The state in many ways still continues to act as though it lives in the agricultural era. Why is it that we get these huge, long holidays in the summer during which our children forget everything they've learned over the previous year. It's because they're expected to go out and help with the farming, with bringing in the harvest. That no longer happens in most parts of Hampshire, where I live. It's partly that the state lives in the Fordist age of the Industrial Revolution, of huge integrated companies that own absolutely everything they do, from top to bottom. The state continues to operate in that way. But just as in the private sector, you've had a revolution based on contracting out, measurements, best